Subcommittee will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials. Our hearing today will focus on the implementation of PTC, positive train control, in the United States, one of the most complex and costly safety mandates ever taken by the railroad industry. Positive train control is a radio or GPS-based system designed to automatically control trains to follow speed limits and avoid train-to-train collisions. Following a deadly commuter train crash in Southern California, Congress mandated the installation of PTC on lines where certain hazardous materials are carried and any line on which passenger or commuter rail services operate. The recent tragic Amtrak crash in Philadelphia has reminded us that while these accidents are rare, they can happen, and PTC will make our rail network safer. This mandate was included in the Rail Safety and Improvement Act of 2008, and Congress set an implementation deadline of December 31st of this year. From the beginning, the PTC mandate was going to be a daunting undertaking to consider what completely implemented PTC will require is 38,000 wayside interfaces, 18,000 locomotives to be upgraded, and 12,000 signals will need to be replaced. While similar systems exist in Europe and on some portions of Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, PTC has never been implemented on such a scale and has never required such a high level of interoperability. Since the 2008 mandate was enacted, freight, passenger, and commuter railroads have spent the last 7 years working to implement PTC. According to the Association of American Railroads, freight rail has spent $5.7 billion to date on PTC and expected to spend a total of $9 billion to fully implement. The American Public Transportation Association has estimated the commuter and passenger railroads will have to spend nearly $3.5 billion on PTC. In addition, the sheer cost and complexities of the system, there have been many unexpected delays. The process of approving PTC pulls along railroad right-of-way was delayed significantly when the Federal Communications Commission mandated that each pull go through an extensive review process. The FCC eventually created a more streamlined process for those approvals, and we'll hear from them today about how it's working. Commuter and passenger railroads have also struggled to buy the necessary radio spectrum for PTC, especially in our dense metropolitan areas. Today we'll discuss how long it will take to get PTC implemented across the country and what it will take to meet this current deadline. In closing, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and regarding these issues, I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Michael Capuano from Massachusetts for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome the panel. I'm looking forward to your testimony and the discussion we have. I think the Chairman has said pretty much everything there is to say about PTC from our end of it. Honestly, this is long overdue in my estimation, and honestly, I'd like to find out. We all know where we are today. Tell me how we get to where we want to be as quickly as we can, because that's what America wants. That's what I want. And if you think you need federal assistance, please say so. Be clear. And I say that because we have our own differences of opinion in the House and the Senate as to whether we should be putting funds up or not. And if you think we should, you should say so. I would like to hear that. With that, I yield back and look forward to the testimony.
I now call on the full committee chairman, Mr. Schuster.
Thank you, Chairman Denham, for holding this hearing today. And I think it's important to start off by saying that the number one, the top priority of this committee and the Department of Transportation is safety. In general, rail safety trends have gone in the right direction over the past years. However, the terrible Amtrak incident in Philadelphia last month showed us that we should always remain focused on our efforts to improve rail safety. As Chairman Denham said, and I believe it's worth repeating, positive train control is one of the most ambitious, complex, costly safety enhancements the railroad industry has ever undertaken. I was the ranking member of the subcommittee in 2008 when Congress enacted the PTC mandate. We knew the mandate would be challenging, but we hoped that railroads would be able to meet that deadline 7 years into the future. Unfortunately, we know today that that will not be the case. With a few exceptions, most railroads, including the largest Class I freight railroads, will not meet December's deadline. This has happened for a few reasons. Technology has been more complicated to create, especially to ensure interoperability between the railroads. Spectrum has been hard to acquire, particularly for commuter railroads and that serve in densely populated metro areas. And finally, the Federal Communications Commission approval process for new telecommunication poles was not set up to handle the tens of thousands of poles needed to deploy PTC. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you today, the witnesses, where the PTC implementation stands, and your testimony will help us to consider how we move forward to deal with the mandate in an appropriate fashion. With that, I yield back.
And I'll call on Mr. DeFazio for any opening statement he have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you sure your microphone's working? Couldn't hear you. Jeff doesn't need a microphone. The Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding the hearing. We're going to focus on the extension of the deadline today. It's clear that the Class 1s aren't going to be able to meet the deadline. Some passenger rail is not going to be able to meet the deadline. But this was not a knee-jerk reaction to Chatsworth, and this has been something that's been a very, very long time in the making. It was 45 years since NTSB first recommended the idea of positive train control. They've had it on their most wanted list for many years. It was temporarily removed after the passage of the legislation in 2008. But it was put back on when it was clear that the deadlines weren't going to be met. Just to revisit why we did this, Chatsworth actually took place after the House had acted. And, it was a compilation of accidents over the years, including, in particular, one in 2005 that was a release of chlorine gas. 5,000 people were evacuated, 8 people died, 554 were injured. The NTSB at the time said they'd never seen anything like it. This was caused by human error, improper alignment of a switch, and had PTC been installed, it wouldn't happen. And then they went back over a litany. This, again, was at the time of passage, 145 accidents, 296 fatalities, 6,700 injuries over the past 45 years since their first recommendation would have been prevented with PTC. So we passed it. Chatsworth took place actually after House passage, which led the Senate to change its position. They started out, I believe, with 2018 as a deadline. And they were pushing at the behest of the 2 California senators 2014, and we compromised on 2015 as something that could be achievable. Unfortunately, we aren't going to meet that deadline in many cases. Congress was helping some of the passenger rail folks with grants. The president's asked for $1 billion. We got one $50 million grant, but since 2010, nothing has been allocated by Congress. Now, for freight, it's a heavy expense, but it's something, at least it's a business expense. For passenger rail, nonprofit passenger rail, it's an expense which is hard to pass on to the customers, but that's pretty much what they have to do, or the local operating jurisdiction. So grants could be helpful, I believe, and we hopefully will hear more about that today. And yet, our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, who doesn't quite take the same view of these issues as we do, we're a little more enlightened on this committee, actually cut Amtrak's capital grants by $290 million the day after the accident, and among other things that those grants fund is positive train control, in addition to other critical infrastructure, which is likely to cause other accidents, derailments, bridge collapse, tunnel collapse. The system is decrepit, needs an incredible amount of investment. Very, very short-sighted. I'd observe that, we got a man to the moon after President Kennedy issued the challenge. It only took 8 years, and that was 1 year after the NTSB first asked for, positive train control. I know we can do it. We just need to hear today what impediments remain and what can we do to expedite the installation across all of the system in the critical categories we defined, toxic by inhalation, routes included, in addition to the passenger and the other very heavily used routes. So I look forward to the testimony And if necessary, I would urge the committee to take further action if we hear testimony today that says we need to take steps to get this done.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. I'd now like to welcome our panel of witnesses. First, Ms. Sarah Feinberg, Acting Administrator, Federal Rail Administration, FRA, and I want to pay a special thanks. You have continued to come before this committee. There have obviously been a number of big issues that this committee is addressing, and you have not wavered as far as coming before and answering some very difficult questions. So we thank you for being here again with us this morning. Also, Mr. Charles Matthias, Associate Bureau Chief, Federal Communications Commission, FCC, Mr. Frank Lonegro, Vice President, CSX Corporation, Mr. Donald Orseno, Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of Metra Commuter Rail, and Russell Kerwin, Deputy Project Manager, Metrolink. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection. So ordered. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you keep your statements limited to 5 minutes. With that, Ms. Feinberg, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Capuano, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Mr. DeFazio, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the implementation of positive train control in the United States. PTC technology is arguably the single most important railroad safety development in more than a century. The technology is not new, though. Elements of PTC have existed since the early 20th century. In fact, regulators and safety advocates have been calling on the rail industry to implement some form of PTC for many decades. The NTSB since 1969. The Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008 required the current functionality of positive train control to be fully implemented by December 31st, 2015. PTC is required on Class 1 railroad main lines where any poisonous or toxic by inhalation hazardous materials are transported. It is also required on any railroad's main line where regularly scheduled intercity or commuter rail passenger service is conducted. Following passage of the PTC mandate in 2008, railroads submitted their PTC implementation plans in 2010. These plans laid out a path forward that would allow each railroad to meet the deadline. As I've stated to this committee before, safety is the Federal Railroad Administration's top priority. The rail system is not as safe as it could be without the full implementation of PTC. A safe rail system requires the full implementation of positive train control. And that's why FRA will enforce the December 31st, 2015 deadline for implementation, just as Congress has mandated. For several years, FRA has been sounding the alarm that most railroads have not made sufficient progress in implementing PTC. In the 7 years since passage of the PTC mandate, FRA has dedicated significant resources and worked closely with the railroad industry in order to assist and guide implementation. We have hired staff to assist and oversee implementation. We've worked directly with the FCC to resolve spectrum issues and improve the approval process related to PTC communication towers. We've built a PTC system test bed at Transportation Technology Center in Pueblo, Colorado. We've provided approximately $650 million in grant funds to support PTC implementation. This includes American Recovery and Reinvestment Act grants, as well as Amtrak grants and other annual appropriations. We've requested $825 million to assist commuter railroads, and we've issued a $967 million loan through the RIF program to New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the nation's largest commuter railroad. I have also established a new PTC task force team within the FRA. That team is aggressively managing and monitoring each individual railroad's progress, tracking data, ensuring we have the most accurate and up-to-date information, and reporting into me multiple times per week. This team is working in close collaboration with the many individuals at FRA based here in Washington and in offices around the country already working on this challenge. But unfortunately, despite FRA's financial support, technical assistance, and warnings, many railroads have stated publicly that they will still not meet the December 31st deadline. Recently, FRA received updated information about PTC implementation from 32 of the 38 railroads that we are currently tracking for enforcement purposes. Initial analysis indicates that Class 1 railroads have completed or partially completed installations of approximately half of the locomotives that require PTC equipment, deployed approximately half of the wayside units, replaced approximately half of signals that need replacement, and completed most of the required mapping for PTC tracks. By the end of the year, AAR projects that 39% of locomotives will be equipped, 76% of wayside interface units will be installed, 67% of base station radios will be installed, and 34% of required employees will be trained. According to APTA, 29% of commuter railroads are targeting to complete installation of PTC equipment by the end of 2015. Full implementation of PTC for commuter lines is projected by 2020. FRA continues our work to finalize an enforcement strategy for those railroads that will miss the deadline. As with any regulatory enforcement posture, our ultimate goal is to bring all railroads into compliance as quickly and as safely as possible. Starting on January 1st, FRA will impose penalties on railroads that have not fully implemented PTC. Fines will be based on FRA's PTC penalty guidelines, which establish different penalties depending on the violation. The penalties may be assessed per violation per day. The total amount of penalty each railroad faces depends upon the amount of implementation progress the railroad has made. FRA is also planning for what will come after the January 1st deadline. In both 2014 and 2015, the Department and FRA asked Congress to provide FRA with additional authorities that would address the safety gap that will exist on many railroads between January 1st, 2016, and each railroad's full PTC implementation. These additional authorities would provide FRA with the ability to review, approve, and require interim safety measures for individual railroads that may fail to meet the PTC deadline. These interim safety requirements would be to ensure railroads are forced to raise the bar on safety if they miss the deadline, but will not and cannot be used to replace or extend the deadline. In conclusion, I want to extend my thanks and appreciation to this committee for its attention and focus on achieving implementation as efficiently and quickly as possible. We look forward to working with you, and I'm happy to respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Feinberg. Mr. Mathias, you may proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Capuano, Chairman Schuster, and Ranking Member DeFazio, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify here today.
Can I ask you to pull your microphone a little closer?
Promoting the safety of life and property through the use of wire and radio communication is a top FCC priority. As the nation's communications agency, the FCC helps coordinate spectrum acquisition by freight and passenger railroads. We also manage the statutorily required historic preservation and environmental reviews of the poles, antennas, and associated infrastructure used to support positive train control or PTC systems. Because the FCC was given no mandate to set aside spectrum for PTC purposes, the FCC has been working closely with the railroads since 2008 to identify available spectrum on the secondary market. The FCC has acted swiftly upon request to approve multiple spectrum transactions, including the Freight Railroad's acquisition of spectrum nationwide, Amtrak's acquisition of spectrum in the Northeast Corridor, as well as requested waivers to better enable and test PTC deployment. To be clear, the Commission plays no role in designing or assessing the railroad's choice of PTC technology. The railroads are responsible for PTC design and deployment. The country's major freights have led the way in securing spectrum for PTC. Through private transactions, they acquired nationwide spectrum in the commercial 220 to 222 megahertz spectrum band just months before the act became law. These railroads quickly focused on utilizing this spectrum when the PTC mandate was established. When they did, the freight railroads effectively drove other railroads, including Amtrak and commuter rails, to spectrum in and around the 220 megahertz band for their PTC operations as well. For most of the country, this strategy appears to have been successful. The FCC has proactively facilitated and continues to facilitate freight and passenger railroads' successful acquisition and lease of spectrum on secondary markets. We have also granted the railroads extensive technical waivers, more transmitter power, for example, to facilitate the use of the spectrum for PTC purposes. Spectrum acquisition in the Northeast Corridor differs from the rest of the country because Amtrak and the freights are deploying two different PTC systems that were not from the outset engineered to be compatible in the same spectrum band. So, unlike in a market such as Chicago, where the freight railroads tell us that 11 different railroads can share the same block of spectrum using a single PTC system, in the Northeast Corridor, the choice to deploy two systems requires two blocks of spectrum far enough apart to avoid interference. FCC staff will continue to work with Amtrak, the commuter rails that use the Amtrak system in the Northeast Corridor, and the freights to help identify solutions to these problems. PTC infrastructure deployments are also a priority. Federal environmental and historic preservation law requires the FCC to assess the potential impacts of agency undertakings, including potential impact on properties significant to tribal nations. To facilitate this process, in May 2014, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation issued streamlined rules for future PTC pole deployments. Under the streamlined approach, the majority of proposed rules are exempt from historic preservation review. The Commission has the capacity to receive 1,400 exempt and non-exempt pole applications from the major freight railroads every 2 weeks. By the middle of June, the freight railroads could have submitted as many as 40,000 poles for review. In fact, the railroads have only submitted around 8,300 poles, or about 21% of our total capacity. Going forward, issues in the Northeast Corridor remain complex and pose significant challenges. We stand ready to work with Amtrak, the commuter rails, the freight rails there and across the country to help them meet their evolving deployment needs. We appreciate the subcommittee's commitment and leadership on this issue and its efforts to ensure the successful deployment of PTC systems. The FCC is committed to working collaboratively with Congress, our federal partners, and the railroads to get the job done. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mathias. I'd now like to call on a representative from Florida, Ms. Brown, to introduce our next witness, Mr. Lonergan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Frank Negro, and you can correct that name, Frank, when it's your time, who will be testifying today for CSX Railroad located in my hometown of Jacksonville, Florida. Frank has worked for CSX since 2000, focused on technology issues, and have taken the lead for the Class 1 Positive Train Control Initiative. CSX is an employer that plays a major, strong role in the Jacksonville community. The company and its CEO, Michael Ward, have been a lone advocate for veterans in Florida and throughout the United States. Let me just say that I'm very proud of it. The Wounded War program, they gave the first $1 million, and they have received 2 years in a row the top award from the president for over 33% of their employees are veterans. So with that, I want to welcome Frank and the other panelists, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Member Brown. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am Frank Lenegro, Vice President of Service Design at CSX. And since the passage of the PTC mandate, I have been the project owner for PTC at CSX. I also chair the industry committee that is tasked with achieving PTC interoperability across 60,000 miles of railroad. Given the recent Amtrak tragedy and remembering all of those who have been impacted by PTC preventable accidents, I believe 4 issues are presented for resolution by this committee. Number 1, why are most railroads unable to meet PTC by 2015? Number 2, why are a few railroads able to make 2015 while the remainder cannot? Number 3, what happens if a PTC extension is not passed? And number 4, what is the path forward? Since PTC was mandated, accidents have happened that were PTC preventable. A turnkey system did not exist in 2008 and had to be created by the rail industry. That task continues. As one of the many railroaders working on PTC every day, let me reflect briefly on accountability. I am ultimately responsible for PTC at CSX, and unfortunately, it will not be completed by the deadline. This is not the result of lack of will or lack of commitment. To the contrary, CSX has provided people, allocated ample funding, and ensured executive support. We are hundreds of millions of dollars over budget, yet CSX has never hesitated to provide the required capital. With these ingredients of success, companies do not fail at delivering projects that are achievable from the outset. Congress shares in this responsibility. The 2015 PTC deadline was not grounded in fact. It was a political compromise reached after Chatsworth. Various constituencies in the House and Senate advocated for 2012, 2014, and 2018. The compromise halfway between those extremes gave us 2015, a political date, not necessarily an achievable date. Other responsible stakeholders are FRA, FCC, and the supplier community. The industry has thousands working on PTC. The FRA has about a dozen. The PTC final rule was published in August of 2014, hundreds of pages of regulations 6 years after the mandate. FRA is requiring significant documentation, validation, safety assessments, and fault analyses. All are geared toward deploying a safe and reliable system, but also require a tremendous amount of time and effort on both sides. No one anticipated the regulatory requirements relating to PTC towers. When FCC realized they would have to clear 20,000 towers, they imposed a moratorium to develop a better process. That moratorium impacted the PTC timeline by over a year. The resulting review process appears to be working. FCC has also recently approved the antenna height waiver, J-block swap, and Canadian border agreement. While each of these is complicated, we do need a greater emphasis on speed, given that much work remains, especially solving the PTC radio interference in the Northeast. Lastly, given the complexity of the technical task, our supplier partners have yet to hit a major deadline or deliver software that is free from defects. In the beginning, I think we all believed PTC was further along. A few railroads have indicated that they will make 2015, most notably Metrolink in the LA Basin and Amtrak in the corridor. Importantly, both railroads had previously promised completion in 2012. I remind us of that not to denigrate their great work, but to illustrate the challenges of PTC even for small deployments. Successful completion in 2015 will be a testament to 7 years of hard work by those railroads and great leadership by PTC veterans like Darrell Maxey and Keith Holt. There are two main reasons why some railroads will make 2015 while others will not. The first is scale. The Amtrak and Metrolink deployments are very similar in size, 100 to 150 engines and 300 to 500 miles of railroad. In contrast, deployment at CSX involves 3,900 engines and 11,000 miles of railroad, about 25 times larger. More engines and more miles means more time. The second is the state of the legacy infrastructure. PTC is brand new technology that does not interface with legacy signaling and dispatching systems. At CSX, PTC is requiring us to completely replace 7,500 miles of wayside signals, geospatially map 21,000 rail miles, and enhance our dispatching system to a precision of 1/10,000th of a mile, all while delivering the nation's freight and passengers. Once we are finished, it will no longer be our father's railroad. If no extension is passed, the railroads have a serious legal dilemma. Does the PTC mandate make it illegal to transport TIH, PIH commodities irrespective of our common carrier obligation? Similarly, we are also required to allow commuter and interstate passenger agencies to run on our lines. Which law should we violate, the passenger requirement or the PTC mandate? If we cannot transport TIH, PIH commodities or passengers by rail, the outcome is not good for the American people or the American economy. If we continue to haul the commodities and the passengers which trigger the PTC mandate, we will be in violation of the law and run the risk of regulatory enforcement, potential uncapped liability, and questionable insurance coverage, an untenable situation for CSX and its employees and shareholders. The need for an extension is clear. The question is how to fashion the extension that recognizes the enormity of PTC, rewards railroads that will make 2015, holds the remaining railroads accountable to complete the project expeditiously, and provides legal certainty for shippers, passengers, and railroads alike. We look forward to working with you to forge that path ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lenegro. Mr. Orseno, we've met several times already, but if I've butchered your last name, as I have twice already and been corrected by colleagues, please let us know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Denham and members of the subcommittee. I would also like to thank Congressman Lipinski. You're our representative on this subcommittee, and we appreciate your championship for transportation. I am Don Orsino, Executive Director, CEO of Metra, as well as the chair of the APTA Commuter Rail Committee. I was lucky enough early in my career to be an engineer, a card-carrying engineer that I was very proud of. I operated trains every single day. It's an enormous responsibility that I didn't take lightly as no engineer does. A few years ago, I was appointed Executive Director, CEO of Metra, and I took those experiences with me early in my career to my position now. Let me be clear, safety is paramount at Metra, and to that end, we are committed to implementing PTC. But let me also be clear on another item, it's not without challenges. Metra is one of the largest commuter rail systems in the country. Last year, we provided over 83.4 million passenger trips. We primarily serve customers commuting from the suburbs to work in Chicago. We operate 11 lines with 241 stations. 4 of those lines owned and operated by the UP and the BN. The region is the nation's busiest rail hub and most complex, with 6 of the Class 7 railroads operating throughout the network. Coordination of PTC implementation must include all of these railroads. The BN and UP were further along with PTC installation than us, so we directed all of our resources to put equipment on the trains that will be operating on the BN and the UP so we could be compliant when they were. Those lines, once they're operational, will be 40% of Metra's fleet will be PTC compliant, covering 50% of our passengers. The BN equipment installation will be complete September of 2015, with the UP following closely behind it the second quarter of 2016. We have also made significant progress on Metra-owned lines. To date, we hired a system integration team, Parsons Transportation Group, awarded contracts to engineering firms to design signal system upgrades, and continue to hire the necessary staff, including leadership positions and field installation crews. Even though we've made substantial progress, the challenges are still remaining. The limited number of signal design systems, spectrum availability. In Chicago, it is undetermined if we have enough spectrum for PTC needs in the region. We won't know that answer until the spectrum study is completed. Continuous verification and validation is part of the testing process to test the reliability and accuracy of PTC. So far, only testing of individual segments has taken place. The FRA must also review and certify the railroad's plans. Interoperability is a huge challenge for Chicago, given the complexity in the integration of the system. Metra's costs are approximately $350 million. APTA estimates approximately $3.5 billion for all commuter railroads. We receive approximately $150 million per year in federal formula funds. These are the same sources of funds that are used for other safety-related critical infrastructure projects, such as bridges, tracks, and rolling stock. Metra has allocated $133 million over the last 2 years for PTC between our state and federal partners. The Metra Board approved a $2.4 billion modernization plan last year, which included $275 million to complete PTC, which is a combination of borrowing and fare increases. The balance would need to come from our state and federal partners, which is uncertain at this time. There is also a significant operational and maintenance cost that these are estimated. It will be $15 million annually for Metra. Given these substantial challenges, it's no surprise that no commuter rail system has fully implemented PTC to date. Metra is estimating 2019 for full implementation. Metra, along with the APTA, are asking Congress to provide FRA the authority to grant individual waivers for the deadline, as long as the agencies show a good faith effort as determined by the FRA. Metra is also asking for funding from Congress. On that note, I'd like to thank Representatives Lipinski and Quigley for introducing H.R. 1405, which reauthorizes the Safety Technology Program for PTC, which is $200 million annually for the next 5 years. Even though PTC will not be fully implemented by the deadline, Metra, however, has taken significant steps to provide safeguards for our passengers. For example, we have reviewed the FRA 2015-03 Safety Advisory and are in the process of implementing automatic notifications through our GPS system. The system will notify the conductor in advance where the speed is reduced by greater than 20 miles per hour for a bridge or curve. The conductor will then communicate and remind the engineer of the restriction. We have also instituted the C3RS program, which is confidential close call reporting, in conjunction with our labor unions at FRA. Before closing, I wanted to bring to the committee's attention, recently a question was raised at the APTA Rail Conference with regards to the commuter rail industry's ability to continue to operate past the PTC deadline as it relates to insurance liability. The commuter railroads are currently investigating this matter. It's Metra's commitment, along with the rest of the commuter rail industry, to implement PTC as expeditiously as possible. With that said, we ask Congress to grant the FRA authority to provide waivers based on good faith efforts and the funding to support the implementation of PTC. And I want to thank the committee for inviting me here today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Marsano. Mr. Kerwin, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Capuano, and members of the committee. My name is Russell Kerwin, Deputy Project Manager for the Southern California Regional Rail Authority, aka Metrolink, Positive Train Control Program. I appreciate the invitation to testify today to update the subcommittee on the most significant investments Metrolink is making to increase the safety of our passengers. It's PTC. I'm proud to report that as of June 14th, Metrolink has fully implemented PTC in Revenue Service Demonstration, RSD, across the entire 341-mile network of Metrolink-owned lines. In addition to this major accomplishment, we will submit our PTC safety plan to the FRA next week on June 30th, seeking FRA certification by the end of the year in accordance with the Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008. Metrolink operates on 7 routes through 6 counties in Southern California, carrying over 43,000 weekday riders. We're also the dispatching hub for about 350 trains that traverse Metrolink property on a daily basis, including trains from BNSF, UP, Union Pacific, that is, and Amtrak. Metrolink's PTC program is a locomotive-centric overlay system based upon the Interoperable Electronic Train Management System, aka IETMS software. The full build-out and testing of Metrolink's PTC infrastructure was completed over the past 6 years, which includes PTC onboard equipment installed and tested on all 109 locomotives and cab cars, all antennas, wayside devices, and PTC radios installed and operational, a robust communication network built out and tested, and a new hardened dispatch and operations facility for PTC constructed and put into service under the project. In addition to our network of owned lines, we are also working closely with our railroad partners, BNSF, Union Pacific, Amtrak, and the North County Transit District, to ensure PTC implementation is achieved throughout the region. We have been very fortunate to have tremendous support from our local freight partners, and we appreciate the many challenges to implementing PTC, most of which have also impacted our program. They include the prolonged nationwide development of this interoperable technology and the need for ongoing software upgrades, development of our back-office server and dispatching systems, relentless testing, impacts to operations, challenges in acquiring spectrum, and funding constraints. In regards to spectrum, Metrolink has been working with the FCC through many challenges to secure approval of the spectrum that we entered into purchase agreement for in 2010. Currently, Metrolink is trying to follow the same procedures under which the FCC's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recently granted Amtrak's application. Through our partnership with the freight railroads, Metrolink has been fortunate to execute a 5-year lease for spectrum from PTC 220 LLC. This lease enables us to meet our near-term needs. However, to long-term needs, we are attempting to acquire our own spectrum. Our current PTC program costs the agency $216.4 million. To put that in context, it's roughly equivalent to Metrolink's entire annual operating budget of $221 million. The majority of our PTC funding, about 85% of it, came from state and local sources. The investment in our PTC program has been very significant for the agency. However, it was the priority of the Metrolink board and our funding partners to implement this life-saving technology. Moving forward, the agency will be required to continue to prioritize funding as we transition into operations. The ongoing costs for project staff, contractors, consultants, and vendors to operate and maintain PTC will increase our budget costs. Metrolink is proud to be leading the industry on PTC implementation. Despite the many challenges, we have maintained our unwavering focus on advancing our PTC program. I would like to thank Chairman Denham and Ranking Member Capuano for the opportunity to testify and share our experience. I'll close my remarks by stating that at Metrolink, we continue to believe that safety is foundational, and our investments in PTC, as well as a number of other safety technologies, are evidence of this unyielding commitment to the safety of our passengers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kerwin. Our first round of questioning will be 5 minutes. I would ask members to keep their questions to 5 minutes. I'll start things off this morning, first of all, with Ms. Feinberg. Again, let me thank you for your response. The last committee meeting, we did something somewhat out of the ordinary and asked you for a quick response with some of the questions that this committee had on the Amtrak crash. I think that those issues are important to resolve and understand quickly, and this committee thanks you for your rapid response. We're getting those answers to those questions back out to committee members this morning. But I did want to continue on an exchange that you and I had had several times now. I've pressed FRA on if positive train control is such a big priority, why are you not using California high-speed rail dollars to upgrade not only the corridor, but those connecting routes in California? In California, obviously, where PTC was started, it is a big concern for those that ride the rail in California. It's a big concern for those that live by rail in California. This is a national issue, but in our home state, we're looking to provide leadership to resolve the safety concerns that people have quickly. And California high-speed rail continues to have its challenges, and certainly by their current burn rate of dollars, they do not appear to be able to spend the money that has been allocated to them by the deadline. And so our ongoing exchange is, what else could you use that money for? Could it be used for safety in California? And I got your written response that it wasn't possible, but I wanted to bring one issue to your attention. Under California High-Speed Rail's investment strategy for Phase 1, they specifically state, electrifying the entire Caltrain corridor so as to replace outdated diesel technology with electric locomotives or electric multiple unit train sets, and introducing positive train control will not only speed up Caltrain service, but pave the way for high-speed rail. Positive train control is a federal mandate that will reduce the potential for train-to-train collisions and improve signaling at crossings so as to allow increased train frequencies while enhancing safety. This money was taken from California High-Speed Rail. They approved the grant agreement to put it in a different corridor, to upgrade Caltrain and put PTCs. Obviously, by their own words, this is a priority for them. Also previously, FRA has diverted funding from the Central Valley with $400 million that went to the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority to construct the foundation for high-speed rail service at the Trans-Bay Terminal. Again, you're moving money out of California's Central Valley, hours away, to where it may connect someday, if it ever gets built, to San Francisco and to LA through Caltrain. And under the High-Speed Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program, the following activities are expressly eligible, as noted in the Federal Register: acquiring, constructing, improving, or inspecting equipment, track and track structures, highway rail grade crossings, improvements related to intercity passenger rail service, including communication and signalization improvements. That sounds a whole lot like PTC to me. Positive train control affects each one of those areas. So I understand by this, they would be able to use these same dollars. So I know from your response, you say the grantee would have to approve this process. The grantee in this case would be California High-Speed Rail. But again, if they're not spending the money, and they've already have the precedent of transferring the money, and safety is all of our number one concern, why would we not take money that is available to be spent in a corridor that is available to be spent under Prop 1A and create a safety, address safety for our state?
Mr. Chairman, we've gone back and forth about this a lot, and happy to continue to go back and forth, both with you, and I know our staffs have had many conversations about it as well. As I said in my letter to you earlier this week, we do not believe that we can take California high-speed rail money and put it into other priorities.
But you've done that a couple of times already. They've requested that you change the grant approval, and you have granted that request, and they've done it several times for PTC, for Caltrain, and for the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority. $400 million, $171 million, and another grant for PTC. It's been done several times already.
I join you in a concern that the California High-Speed Rail Authority is not burning through ARA money in a sufficiently fast manner, and we are working with them very closely to make sure that they meet all of their obligations to do so. Our legal analysis of where we are at this moment is that we cannot shift money that has already been obligated to California High-Speed Rail and move it to another priority. It would have to go, even if we were willing to take money away from California High-Speed Rail, it would go back to the U.S. Treasury. But we will continue to engage with you on this and talk through it with you.
Thank you. That appears to be a change in policy since it's already happened several times. I would understand if California High-Speed Rail, if you need them as the grantee to make the request to FRA, then my question would be to the High-Speed Rail Authority, if they've already spent money on PTC, why, if this is a priority for FRA, the administration, and California High-Speed Rail, are they not improving safety in California?
I do not believe it's a change in policy, but we can continue the conversation.
Thank you. My time's expired. We will have a second round because I've got many other questions from a more national perspective, but as you know, California is a big concern of mine, and so is California High-Speed Rail. I now go to Mr. DeFazio for 5 minutes and would recognize the fact that Mr. Capuano once again has been very gracious to our colleagues on the other side to skip his time so that others may go first.
I don't think Capuano and gracious go together in the same sentence, but certainly I would defer to your judgment, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Feinberg, you heard what CSX raised about the potential conflict with the hard deadline and whether or not that, their continued carriage of, inhalables and other hazardous and passenger. Can you resolve that, or do we have to statutorily resolve that?
The Congress is going to have to act. I cannot make a legal decision for CSX based on their liability.
And you can't give relief because of the hard deadline that was set?
I cannot extend the deadline.
Okay. Now, you talked about enforce and you talked about penalties, and I'd just like to get a little insight into that. We're looking forward now, and there's a lot of history here that, a lot of questions about how we got to this point and how some people are much closer to meeting the deadline than others, et cetera. So are you looking at penalties that exact funds from the railroads? Wouldn't it be better if you mandate everybody puts together a schedule that you would approve or not approve in terms of how quickly they can implement, put in benchmarks, and then look at assessing penalties going forward?
Well, that would really be extending the deadline. That would be our view. I mean, the deadline is the deadline, and if we then communicate to railroads, if you don't like the deadline that we have, why don't you come up with a plan that involves a new deadline for yourself? That would actually, in my opinion, be extending the deadline. So, so we would not want to go about that. But in terms of the penalties, there is, 3 or 4 pages of specific fines and penalties that were finalized back in 2010 that, go from everything from not equipping a locomotive to failure to have PTC in a certain segment. So it's quite detailed and it's in the public realm.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to get at here is everybody here wants to get this done as quickly as possible. There's a lot of history. And in order to go forward, I'm wondering, if we give you flexibility from the deadline, but we give you a mandate that it will be implemented as soon as practicable, technologically and physically practicable, by each of those who do not meet, and then you set benchmarks, and then they violate the benchmarks, that's when I think fines might be appropriate. Would that be a way to go forward?
Well, I take my cues from the Congress, and I enforce what the Congress mandates. So if the Congress instructs us to enter negotiations like that, we would do that. But again, my concern would be entering into brand new negotiations with each individual railroad based on what they would like their new deadline to be.
Well, I'm not thinking so much what they would like. I'm saying that's why as soon as practicable physically, and not something that meets their convenience or their capital outlays or whatever. It's just like, anyway, this is a difficult issue. Quick to the FCC. You now have the capacity to deal with these poll applications and approvals in a streamlined way. And as I understand it, there are quite a few that have not been applied for, and you aren't pushing your capacity here. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir. Thank you. We have since our streamlined process was put into place, we've had the capacity to review about 40,000 polls. To date, we've only received applications to review about 8,300, so we're ready for more work.
Okay. That's something to take into account as we're moving forward. Just this is off the subject, but I got to ask you very quickly, Mr. Mathias, 5.9 gigahertz. You know, we get part of the problem here was you have to go out and buy spectrum and negotiate, and Amtrak had to negotiate, and this that was. I'm really concerned about what you might do with the 5.9 gigahertz for smart cars and communication between vehicles of the future. There's some proposals to maybe parcel that up a little bit, which might lead to interference, which might lead us to a point where smart car manufacturers in the future are going to have to go out and buy spectrum as opposed to having something reserved. And I just hope you would take that under advisement.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. And then to CSX, how soon can you get it done?
At CSX, our plans call for us to be hardware installed, meaning all of the wayside interface units, all the, the obsolete signal replacement work that we're doing, all the locomotives equipped, all the technology hardware installed by the end of 2018, with full deployment by 2020. And as I say that, though, I think it's important to know that by the end of 2018, we will have a significant portion of the system operable. So it's not as if we get to 2020 and then we turn on the 11,000 miles that we have under our PTC footprint. It is a very methodical, almost linear implementation pretty much from here on out. We'll have about 500 miles in place by the end of the year, which is about the size of the corridor and about the size of the Metrolink deployment, and then we get into the thousands of miles per year that ramps us up through 2020.
Well, again, that seems like, a long time, and that's why I was proposing the idea that the administrator, I don't think we should be giving people a blanket exemption until 2020, because some people are going to then take till 2020 who don't need to. Maybe you do. But I think there needs to be some level of review of that, and I think that's something the committee will be looking at. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Feinberg, you've testified, and others at FRA have testified before Congress, that if the December 31st deadline is not met or not extended, you will use all the enforcement powers, including warnings, emergency orders, enforcement fines, to encourage PTC to be adopted. But will you share with Congress a transparent policy with regard to how you will determine who the good actors are, the bad actors are? I think you've categorize them that way, and what I'm looking for is metrics. Are there ways to measure it so that it's not arbitrary, so everybody knows going into this? And I see you've got some bullet points I got here on things you intend to do, but I'm really looking for how will you measure CSX versus BNSF versus UP versus Metrolink to be able to determine that.
Absolutely, and we would not want to be arbitrary or subjective. We would want this to be quite black and white so that railroads would know what to expect and that the Congress would know what to expect. What was summarized in my oral testimony was an attempt to be quick and to move through the 5 minutes quickly. But our plan is to take the penalty and fine schedule that is already laid out and to be very transparent about what our approach will be, and to communicate it both to the Congress and to railroads so that everyone knows what to expect.
Will that be seen? Will we be able to see that shortly? When do you expect to have that done? Because the deadline's getting awfully close, and we want to make sure that there's a transparent. Because again, I've seen agencies in the past be very arbitrary. Don't like one person over another.
No, that would not be our approach, and that would not be the way we would go about it. We will be very transparent about it. We owe the Congress an update on PTC implementation, on how railroads are doing in implementing PTC. Due to recent feedback we've gotten back from the Congress, it's clear that the Congress would like that report to also include very specific information about how each railroad is doing individually, but also what our enforcement strategy will be. So we are now including that in the report and plan to get it to you as quickly as possible.
And if you go to levying fines against people, would that be on a daily basis, a monthly, weekly? How would you levy those?
The statute lays out that it can be per violation per day, but there is some amount of discretion there.
And would you consider shutting down a railroad?
I think that would be actually up to the railroad's own lawyers would probably make the determination. We've certainly heard from railroads that their lawyers are making that determination based on both their liability and the likelihood of the magnitude of fines and penalties.
Thank you very much. And in terms of transit systems and commuter rails, my understanding is you folks are having a very difficult time. I know that SEPTA down in the southeast has to make some real tough decisions on whether they're going to replace cars, track, because there's just so much money in the budget. Can you tell us a little bit about Chicago?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Schuster. That is definitely a major challenge for us. As I stated earlier, we get about $150 million through our federal formula funds. PTC alone is $350 million to $400. We have to balance using that money for other safety-sensitive concerns like bridges. I mean, bridges are very important. We've got many bridges that were built in the 1800s, and we're in the process of doing those projects. It's very important for us to find the funding and make sure we can get this implemented. It is a very significant safety enhancement. There's no question about it, but it also competes with every other safety issue that we have.
And you've got to be the most challenged of all the systems because you have all Class 1s coming in and around Chicago, so that interoperability, is that a significant challenge, or is that something you're moving towards working out?
That is a huge, significant challenge for us because you've got 6 of the 7 Class 1 railroads coming in and out of Chicago that have to communicate between each train, all the signal locations in the back office. That has been probably one of the most significant challenges for the industry is the interoperability.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we'll go to Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Spranger, first of all, let me just say that every last one of us supports safety in the industry. But I think you are leaving me when you talk about daily fines. The industry itself have spent over $5 billion on positive train control, and I don't feel that the Federal Railroad Administration or this U.S. Federal Communication Commission, we've had daily, not daily, but we've had meetings where we've discussed spectrum, and I don't think that the administration have done all they need to do to move us forward. And to sit here and say that we're going to have daily fines and we may have to shut down the industry, it's not going to fly. And so I would like for you to respond to that.
Ma'am, I was responding to the question about what our authority is in terms of fining. We are now working on our enforcement strategy, and we'll communicate it to you.
No, I'm not talking about enforcement. I'm talking about support, what we've done to help the industry. For example, with the spectrum, Amtrak had to purchase it. How come we did not provide it for the industry? And they had a hard time getting it, and that delayed the projects.
I'll let the FCC answer the spectrum question, but I can tell you from the FRA's perspective, we have hired a significant staff. One of the witnesses previously said there's only a dozen staff at FRA working on PTC. That's absolutely incorrect. We have staff in Washington and across the country. We have offered loans. We have asked for grants. We have offered financial assistance. We have offered assistance across the board. We are still waiting for safety plans to come in from railroads and based on implementation.
I hear what you're saying, but as far as I'm concerned, you all have been the caboose as far as helping and assisting us moving forward. And I don't mean it in a negative sense, but we've had, you're acting, you haven't been here the entire time. We've been going over this for years, and we just have not gotten administration or where it needs to be as far as assisting moving forward. I mean, when we say positive train control, it's a combination. What happened at Amtrak, it wasn't just didn't have positive train control, didn't have the proper equipment as far as the cars are concerned, had to purchase the spectrum. It's just a whole list of things that I feel that the administration should have worked, and I don't mean this administration, I'm saying it's been a multiplicity of administrations that haven't done everything that they needed to do to get us where we need to be. Now, even if they come up with, well, here we are, even if they come up with it in 2018, then it still would take 2 or 3 years to determine whether or not the system working together.
Ma'am, I can only speak for this administration. I can't speak for previous administrations, but this administration has done a great deal to try to bring railroads along and into compliance with a mandate that was passed by this Congress in 2008. And we have been sounding the alarm for years about our concern that railroads were not going to meet the deadline. And so I believe this administration has done a great deal of work to bring railroads along, but we have not seen the progress that we need to.
All right. I'm just letting you know you're leaving me, but go ahead to the next person.
You're asking about the question of the Amtrak spectrum?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. The way the railroads approached this process initially, they selected a spectrum band in the 220 to 222 megahertz. I'm sorry to get technical on you, but it's a part of the spectrum that was already owned by other people. It has licensees. Unfortunately, in that case, what we would have had to do to give that spectrum to anyone else is we would have had to have taken it away from the existing owners through a process that would have required compensation, finding them additional spectrum, and also potentially would have led to litigation. So what we thought would be a more productive approach would be to actively work with Amtrak to find spectrum on the secondary market that they could use for PTC in the same spectrum block.
Well, as we move forward, that is an issue that the Congress needs to address. My next round, I'll go to you, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. Rice, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Feinberg, and you may not have been around when all this started, but why is there the need to create this new system? I mean, it seems to me that there are so many systems that are similar to this. It would be incredibly cheaper and quicker to institute. Why did we settle on creating this entire new system?
Well, I think PTC is actually an overlay of some other systems, but if you're referring to ATC and some of the technologies we've talked about in this committee previously, it's basically a step beyond that. But it would assist in taking human factors off the table. It's one of the most important technologies that we believe can be implemented for rail safety.
Mr. Kerwin, I'm going to switch over to you because maybe you know more about the technical aspects. You're a project manager, right? You're putting this stuff in.
Yes, sir.
You know, I know that there are GPS systems out there that you can buy for $1,000 that will control the motion of a vehicle, right? Stop it and start it and all that kind of thing.
It tells you where you're at, but as far as controlling the vehicle, I'm not.
I've had one on my boat that cost $900 that would steer my boat to a point. Now, why is this so much more difficult than that?
The key to PTC is it's not a specific technology as much as a specification that it prevents train-to-train collisions.
Well, I mean, as long as the GPSs were connected, it seems to me that it could do that very, very easily. I mean, this seems to me that this is light years easier than a Google car or whatever you call the thing, because a Google car's got to sense people walking in front of it and obstructions appearing, and this doesn't have to do any of that. This just has to control motion. I mean, all it can do, it can't steer. It's got to go how fast, how slow, or stop, right?
Yeah.
Not that complicated.
I understand and appreciate your point. It is much more complicated than it would seem. One of the key factors is interoperability. PTC mandate requires seamless transition from one railroad to another railroad's property and the communication between different railroads.
I understand that, but I mean, all this GPS technology exists today. Mr. Lenegro, I'm going to switch over to you. Do you have technology today before this technology we're talking about here that you know where all your locomotives are? I mean, can you tell where they are at any time when they're running?
We've had GPS on our locomotives for, I'd say, the last half a dozen years or so, but I think it's important to understand GPS is one of I'll say 100 just for raw numbers, inputs into PTC. It simply provides one input, and that is where the train itself is. It's not an indicator of speed. It's not an indicator of grade. It's not an indicator of where the red signal is. It's not the indicator of where the work zone is. So, and I could go on and on, but I know you don't want me to. But that's just one input into it. The technology you referred to earlier about access is based on a cap signal method of operation. At CSX, we only have about 400 of the 11,000 miles uses cap signal as a method of operation, and then ATC is built on top of that, and the access system that Amtrak's using is built on top of that. That's not a system that we utilize to run our trains.
All these other guys up here are dealing with taxpayers' money, and you're not. Did y'all do an analysis of whether it would be cheaper to use some of these legacy systems that could control the train, or to create this entire new system that I think this says that they're doing 23,000 locomotives. It costs $9 billion. That's about $400,000 a locomotive. Did CSX do an analysis to determine whether it would be cheaper to modify the existing legacy systems or to create this entire new system?
So there's a couple answers to your question. In the beginning, yes, we did an analysis about whether we should go the Amtrak route and the access system, or whether we should, go with the system that the freight railroads have been working on since the mid-'90s, which the precursor was known as CBTM, which was communications-based train management. The thing that's important to know is that there are generally 3 or 4 methods of operations that freight railroads use to navigate their trains. A very small proportion of that is cap signal, as I mentioned, signal territory, and then non-signal territory, and there are permutations of all of that. The only thing that Access works on is that first method of operation, which is cap signal territory. So we would have had to change the entire method of operation of the entire railroad to cap signal, which would have required both wayside changes, technology changes, as well as locomotive changes. And yes, we did look at the two and believe that IETMS, or the freight version of PTC, was the right way to go, and still believe that today, sir.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kerwin, you said you spent $216 million on PTC. You've got it fully installed now?
We have it fully deployed on our network of owned lines. We're working with our freight and partners and Amtrak to get those systems in service.
How many locomotives do you have?
109 locomotives and cab cars that need to be equipped.
Okay. So you spent about $2 million per locomotive then?
Our total cost is, our budget is $216, and we have spent about $200 million of that. That's not just installations on locomotives. There's a tremendous amount of back office components and wayside components as well. So.
Sounds ridiculously expensive to me, but he's messing with his dollars, I believe. If he says he did the analysis, it came out cheaper that way, I understand. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman, Mr. Lipinski, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Obviously, we all want to make sure that we do everything we can for safety. It's been a very difficult issue. I want to thank Administrator Feinberg for her work on this and other things. A very difficult time coming into the position as administrator here. I just want to first make sure that we're all clear. You're saying that the FRA doesn't have the authority to shut down railroads. It's the fines that are what the FRA is able to level in if the mandate's not extended.
Ultimately, if we needed to take the action to shut down a railroad, I think we could do that. But my point was that I think what we're hearing from railroads is that's a decision that they are making in consultation with their lawyers on how they would operate on January 1st if they're not fully implemented.
I don't know if that makes sense to me, Mr. Lenegro, Mr. Orsino. I don't know if you want to add anything to that in regard to the fines and the impact that they could have on you.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Lipinski. Being in the commuter side of the industry, we depend very heavily on tax dollars. What the commuter rail industry has advocated was for an extension, not a categorical extension, but an extension based on good faith efforts, based on the railroad's ability to complete PTC. I don't think personally it would be in the public's best interest to fine railroads that typically don't have the funding to implement PTC. I think we need to find a solution where we can implement PTC as expeditiously as possible and not fine the railroads, because it's just coming, right out of our pot that we use for, bridges and cars and everything else it takes to operate the railroad.
Thank you. Mr. Lonegro, do you have anything you?
Yes, sir, if I may. It doesn't matter how big the bear chasing you is or how big the cattle prod is. If you're running as fast as you can't run any faster. And so the fines, we've spent $1.2 billion. We've got 1,000 people working on the project. It's hard to say that we haven't put the best foot forward that we possibly, could. And so we've supplied the FRA with both an aggregate level of information in terms of where we've been. We've done that on an annual basis since the end of 2012. The NTSB has asked for it in the interim 6 months. We've provided that information. We have given a prognosis on a railroad-by-railroad basis about when we'll be done.
I don't have much time, and I just don't want to.
So I don't believe the fines. I don't believe the fines would be helpful.
All right. I just first of all, we all want to sit up here and find villains, and in this situation, I think it's very complex, and there are not easy answers to this. We just want to move forward as quickly as possible. I've been in favor. I've tried. I've worked on getting more federal funding, especially for commuter rail. Mr. Ursino, so you're saying about $350 million to finish by 2019. Is that the?
That is correct. That's a conservative number. As we get moving into the process further along, as all these things have a tendency to change, but that is a conservative number.
And did you receive any funding from the Railroad Safety Technology Grant Program or any other FRA grant programs?
No, we have not.
And would additional federal funding help expedite the safety efforts and help Metra invest in its infrastructure?
There's a very strong possibility that additional funding would help us move the project along faster, but I also want to be very clear that there's only a limited number of resources that are available for installation and purchasing things and, the supply and demand chain. We definitely can look at moving it quicker, and if we had federal funding, we could take the funding that we are using for that right now for other things. Like I explained before, we've got cars that are 60 years old. We've got bridges that are built in the 1800s. We could address some of those issues.
I just want to also make the point that Metra has significantly increased, has needed to increase fares, has a long-term plan of increasing fares. So you're doing your part in regard to that. Very quickly, before I conclude, I want to touch on one other safety-related issue. Administrator Feinberg, regardless of whatever plan FRA chooses or is mandated to use moving forward, I hope your agency keeps careful tabs, as I do, on CN's PTC efforts and the reports they submit. We already know from CN's reports that they have the least ambitious and aggressive timeline for finishing their PTC installations, and some other issues we've had with them, which we have discussed, and I think we need to make sure we follow up and keep rails as safe as possible. Thank you. I yield back.
Certainly, and if I could just make one point in response to the back and forth, that we have asked for a sum total of $2 billion to go towards PTC implementation and technologies, $825 million in Grow America, but altogether $2 billion. So we are absolutely in favor of additional federal funding going to PTC implementation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Perry, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Ms. Feinberg. Got a question here for you. I'll start out with a little bit of a statement. Just to make sure I'm clear, it's my understanding the FRA, and this comes from testimony, FRA will use all its enforcement powers, including warnings, emergency orders, and enforcement fines, to encourage PTC adoption. Do we know how the FRA would assess the fines? Would they be assessed daily? Is there a policy that's been defined yet regarding that?
So the goal of our enforcement actions, and I think probably any safety regulator's enforcement actions, is to bring about compliance and implementation.
I understand the
as
goal. Do you have a policy? Do
safely
we
and
know what's coming?
efficiently as possible. As we discussed a little bit earlier, we are finalizing that now. Most of the enforcement policy is public and has been public since 2010. There are various fines and penalties based on whether it's locomotives or segments of track, but most of it's been public since 2010, and we are, in response to the Congress's request, finalizing our strategy now so that we can be completely transparent about what railroads and the Congress can expect.
So it might be daily, it might be otherwise.
That's correct.
Okay. So a few weeks ago, when you were here, right after or shortly after the horrible mishap down in Philadelphia, I asked you how much of the $1.3 billion in stimulus money that was received some time ago, because it was such an issue, right? And there was questions about Congress and one particular party not being responsive and cutting money for PTC. So how much of the stimulus money, when everything was in one hand in this town, was spent on PTC for Amtrak, in particular in the Northeast Corridor, right? Do you remember that question?
I do remember that question, and it's $400 million of ARA went towards PTC. That's not Amtrak specific, and I'm sorry, I didn't realize you wanted just Amtrak specific, but it's $400 million total.
$400 million.
I believe
right?
it's 36 for Amtrak. Yes.
Okay, all right. So right now, and that's federal funding, we're looking at $9 billion is what the estimated cost of freight railroads, right? We spent
Total.
Yeah, total, right? With this deadline. Well, but you can see the dichotomy, you can see the difference, right? We don't have PTC where we have money, and we're asking for exponentially more. We're not asking, but that's the requirement right, investor-owned. This is private money, $9 billion. Let me ask you about the deadline. I'm calling it arbitrary. What is your opinion about the deadline? Does it take into account the technical aspects? Does it take into account the frequency spectrum aspects? Does it take into account the timeline where the FRA took nearly a year to approve one of the plans that is required by each railroad? Does it take into account those things, the deadline?
It's your deadline. It's the Congress's
I'm
deadline.
asking your opinion.
I believe it is a good deadline, and in fact, it was a deadline that was reached during negotiations.
I understand.
It was
so you say it's
preferred
good, but
by
does
the
it take
railroad.
into account those things? Should it mean?
I believe that in 2008, when you passed this deadline, you took those things into account.
You think we did? Okay, and we foresaw all the things that might occur or not occur regarding frequency spectrum, regarding approvals, regarding finances. That was all known. There was no political solution to the two sides, one wanting earlier, one wanting later.
I think there was an understanding in 2008 that while this would be complicated, it had been called for since 1969 and would not be so complicated it would be missed.
Okay. I asked for your opinion. I appreciate it. So under the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2015, FRA was directed to provide a report to Congress on implementation within 180 days. Do you know what the status of that is?
Yes, previously we had a quick discussion about it. It was due to the committee, I believe, a week ago. In recent weeks, we've gotten additional insights or additional requests from the Congress about additional information they want in that report. We're updating it now and should have it to you in days.
But was it on time or wasn't it?
No, sir, it was due last week, 1 week ago.
So it's not in yet?
That's correct. It's supposed to be an update on where the railroads are in implementation.
I understand, but Congress also approved that, gave 180 days. Everybody agreed. There was a negotiation.
The Congress has asked for it to now include our enforcement strategy.
Things
and
changed, right?
Railroad by railroad
Things
information.
changed. So who should we fine at the FRA when they're not timely?
You can feel free to hold me accountable for the fact that the report is a week late.
What should the fine be?
I'll leave that to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Mr. Series.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I travel on the Northeast Corridor constantly back and forth, and I'm still trying to get this idea with the spectrum, how we wind up with two. In places like Chicago, they only have one, and more than 11 companies use it. I just don't understand why we just can't come up with one system. Now we have to worry where one is going to interfere with the other. To me, it just doesn't make sense. when other parts of the country use one system? Can somebody address that? How did we get to this? How did we get to this point?
I think it goes back to the conversation we had a few minutes ago where the access system for Amtrak was really developed for passenger rail and specifically for high-speed passenger rail. There is a certain way that passenger railroads run their operation, and they utilize certain technologies to run their trains, dispatch their trains, and the freight railroads have literally a different way of running the railroad. And so those two systems...
But is this a company not making a concession to the other, or Amtrak not making a concession to you? I mean, I don't understand it.
Well, we're all making concessions, candidly.
Well, how do we end up with two if we're all making concessions?
The systems are separate. They rely on communications as a fundamental aspect. And so what we're really doing is the data transmission is using two radios, which are going to use two separate but close pieces of spectrum. And the closer those pieces of spectrum are, the more interference there can be. But I'd say that we're actively working between Amtrak, the Northeast commuters, as well as the FCC to solve that problem. And we believe we have line of sight to that. I don't know if Mr. Mathias would like to comment on that.
You know, and I have the FRA says that 40% of all accidents are a result of human performance failures. The railroads, however, claims that PTC would only prevent 4% of all accidents, inferring that the cost outweighs the benefits. How do we come up with 4%?
We looked at all of the accidents over, I believe it was either a 10 or a 12-year period, all accidents, right? And I'm not sure that the FRA looked at all accidents. They may have looked at a subset of all accidents. Accidents are generally caused by a couple of things, either the conditions or the behaviors, right? The conditions could be track-related, signal-related, the equipment could be how the car operates or some of the components on that, and the same on the locomotive side. And then you have behavioral base. So is there something that happened in the cab of the locomotive, the human factor side of things? We looked at the entire portfolio of accidents and did the math on things that we thought were PTC preventable, and were not, and came up with that 4%. At CSX, it's actually only 2%.
2%?
Yes, sir, 2% of all accidents, PTC preventable.
So, in other words, in your eyes, you don't think it's worth it, make this investment?
You know, I think we're well past that conversation, to be honest with you, member. We have already spent $1.2 billion on it. We have good line of sight to completion of the hardware by 2018 and full deployment by 2020. I think we're well past that conversation.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hardy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Feinberg, I've read your testimony clear through. And it states in your testimony, it seems that FRA is ready to act directing penalties on PTC if not implemented. Also, you state that FRA is ready to act in the interim to bring railroads into safety compliance. You suggest that Congress should authorize FRA to require railroads to use alternative safety technology on specified lines. You also say, and I quote, "These requirements will likely be costly to railroads." Can you share with me your ideas on this alternative technology?
Sir, what I was referring to was what I would refer to as the safety gap that will exist between January 1st, 2016, so the day after the deadline, and when PTC is actually implemented by each railroad, and what, if anything, should be done to raise the bar on safety during that gap. So whether it's additional communication between crew members and additional person in the cab, we have not made final determinations. I think they would be railroad by railroad specific, but it would be how do you increase safety between the date of the deadline that is missed and when PTC is actually implemented.
In your testimony, you stated that these will be costly to railroads. So you've clearly run the numbers on how much it'll cost. Can you share with me those calculations or how you come to that point with that statement?
We just frequently hear from railroads that items like additional crew members are quite costly. That's based on that assertion.
Okay. Mr. Arcino, with the safety being paramount, I'd like you to delve into the costs a little more. In your testimony, that the commuter and the freight rail industries will have spent over billions of dollars on PTC implementation, although progress has been substantial, but it remains to be done before PTC can be safely implemented nationwide. Companies on how much money have they spent out of pocket. Do you believe these costs will be passed down to consumers, which is naturally what happens, but I just want to hear from you. Is that?
In my opinion, yes, they would be passed down to consumers. When we raise our fares in order to cover PTC costs and other items, we have to pass those costs on, depending on, we only have X amount of state and federal funding. The challenge that we have on the commuter rail side is the higher you raise the fares, the less likely you're going to retain all of your ridership. At a time when we want to get more people on our trains and off the roads, that's a big challenge for us. So it's a very difficult balancing act to still be able to provide safe, valuable service for our customers.
Do you believe that we've done all that we can as a committee, as Congress, to help move this process forward? Do you feel like that you're being penalized for our lack of action or inaction, or the FRA's actions or inactions? I'd like to hear your opinion on that also.
That's a challenging question.
Yes, it is.
The answer is this is a very expensive proposition for all railroads, especially commuter railroads, where we don't have the type of funding that we need. I believe that Congress needs to fund the PTC project. It's important. It's important for the safety of our customers, our employees, and the communities we operate through. So it's very important to me that the federal government supplies some funding for it.
Thank you. Mr. Lonegro, you made the statement that the immediate impact of the deadline will be that RSIA has the potential of making certain rail operations illegal. Can you discuss these ramifications a little bit more, if you would, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We're in a legal dilemma. As I mentioned in the opening testimony, we have a law that requires PTC to be implemented on lines that carry passengers and lines that carry certain commodities, TIH and PIH commodities. And so the transport of those after January the 1st of 2016 would run in contravention to the Rail Safety Improvement Act. Yet we also have a common carrier obligation that requires us to haul freight that's tendered on reasonable requests and at reasonable terms and conditions. And so, you know, we're in a situation of which law do we violate? And we have that same conundrum on the passenger side. I mean, Amtrak runs over us, you know, a law that's 40, 45 years old. And so we're required to, you know, allow Amtrak to run, as well as a number of other commuters, including Mr. Orsino. And, you know, we also have this obligation under the Rail Safety Improvement Act, which requires us to complete PTC on those same lines. And so if we're not able to meet it on those lines, do we need to tell Mr. Orsino that he can't run? I mean, these are the challenges, you know, that many, many lawyers right now are trying to resolve. And we don't have the answer to that quite yet.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Ms. Esty, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Denham, and thank you for remarkably gracious Ranking Member Capuano for waiting so long. I want to thank both of you for holding today's hearing. This subcommittee's work is extremely important to the thousands of folks in my district in Connecticut who ride these rails every day, and to the businesses who rely on the freight service as well in Northwest and Central Connecticut. And I hear a lot from a lot of those commuters that they are very concerned about rail safety, as you can imagine, with the last 2 years. And we've been talking about, ever since the fatal collision in 1969, we've been talking about positive train control. And as you can sense from today's hearing, there's increasing impatience and concern about how long that's taking. Now, I think we really need to get down to brass tacks of what are the carrots and sticks, what are the incentives at this time, recognizing the difficulty with spectrum, the difficulty with interoperability, and with the budget challenges. What do we do now to move this forward as expeditiously and safely as possible? And that's where I'd like to start from. The past is the past. We are here now. We are in June of 2015. How do we get this moving forward to keep people safe? So first, as Acting Administrator Feinberg, again, thank you for your patience and your transparency and your exceptional availability to us on the committee. We value that quite a lot. In your testimony, you noted that you think FRA needs the authority, given the situation right now, over the PTC control systems to test them, as well as to provide for interim safety measures when they do not meet that deadline, which it's all very clear most of them will not be meeting that deadline. Could you expand and say, what should we be doing in this committee? What should this committee of jurisdiction be doing to give FRA authority, and why?
Thank you for the question. I think the most important thing that we can do starting now and going forward is to provide railroads with the resources that they need to implement PTC. So this administration has asked, the FRA has asked for significant resources for the commuter railroads so that they can implement PTC. I think that's the most important thing that can happen. But additionally, in terms of our authority, the statute is quite narrow. And so as others have discussed, we really do run into a problem on January 1st where the law is the law. And despite preferences of railroads, I can't give waivers. I can't base waivers on good faith. I can't extend the deadline, and I won't extend the deadline. And so we have to figure out how to move forward past January 1st to make sure that passengers, folks who live near and along rail, are safe. And so I'm happy to continue to work with the Congress on that, but the most important thing is to make sure that we're providing resources so that we can actually bring this technology online quickly.
A quick follow-up question. Do you believe that the railroads that fail to meet that deadline, and I'm asking now under current law, will be subjected to increased tort liability? Are we going to, because the insurance issues are already raised here today. That is obviously a very, very big stick that, again, I think this committee needs to understand what is the legal opinion of FRA about that, as well as the railroads.
The opinion of the FRA, look, I don't want to give the railroads legal advice, and I'm probably the only person in this room who's not a lawyer, but we are certainly hearing from the railroads that they absolutely believe that they are in increased liability as of January 1st, and we agree with them.
Well, I think we need to get to work on that because that's not in anybody's interest as we move forward. Mr. Mathias, good to see you. We went to college together, so thank you for being here. I'm hearing from the railroads, and particularly in the Northeast Corridor, we've heard other members reference this, the difficulty about spectrum. What is it from your perspective, from the FCC's perspective, that we can do, particularly in the very congested space, and that is spectrum space, as well as physical space, that we should be doing to expedite the safety in the Northeast Corridor, the most heavily trafficked area in the country?
Thank you. It's good to see you, too. Thank you for your question. We have an increasingly good news story in the Northeast Corridor with regard to spectrum. It's my understanding that currently Amtrak has the spectrum it needs to deploy, which would be relevant for Connecticut. In addition, we currently have in front of us a proposed transaction that would provide the MTA additional spectrum to provide coverage between New York and New Haven, which would fill a gap in their spectrum coverage. And we also understand that the MBTA has the spectrum that we need. So what our job will be is to ensure that we're working as quickly as we can or fully engaged to make sure that those transactions are completed as quickly as possible as soon as we have the information, and to be ready in case something changes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Micah.
Okay, let's go right to Mr. Mathis. You're talking about the Connecticut connection of putting PTC in from Boston to New Haven. Isn't that most of what Amtrak doesn't own?
No, sir. The Amtrak has spectrum.
No, but that's where it was installed. It's installed there, isn't it? Last hearing you gave us a map, and that one was complete. That was pretty much complete.
Yes, sir.
Right, but that's really mostly under a private operation. Amtrak runs trains over it. They don't own that part of the line. I'm telling you that they don't own it. I know. Okay. All right. Just interesting that they could get it done. Okay. Let's go to the acting administrator. Here she is back asking for money again. And last question I asked, how many RIF loans had been given since 2012? And first I got to answer till last year, 2, and then add 1. We got to 3. Is it still 3? 3 RIF loans since 2012?
Yes, sir.
Okay. How many of those were for PTC?
1.
1. Okay. 30. You could say 33% of them. It sounds more impressive.
Good idea.
Let's go back to our communications guy. There was 11,000 backlog you took care of. At one time, I thought there was as many as 20,000 applications.
We understand from the railroads that their total deployment would be approximately 30,000.
What is your number of applications approved, and what is your backlog at this point?
We have approved about 80. We have had before us for review 8,300. We have no backlog today.
No backlog. They're all approved, and you're expecting more. In the past, and I gave you credit before, your average processing was about 2,000 a year. Is that correct? Or did I lie?
I think we were able to do more.
Okay. Where's my guy from? Okay. Metrolink. When was the accident, Metrolink? Was
2008 was the Chatsworth.
2007?
2008.
2008. I was, Mr. Oberstar, we did the bill. You still don't have positive train control in all of Metrolink service, or do you?
We have our entire system of Metrolink-owned lines in service.
By what?
Metrolink-owned lines are all in service.
With positive train control?
With positive train control.
What's missing then?
The lines that we run on with our freight partners are not currently PTC operational with our.
But Ms. Feinberg, we'll go back to her. She just testified she's going to hammer those freight people, and the hammer's coming down the end of the year, right? Is that what you said? I heard you in the beginning.
I said we would enforce the deadline.
You're going to enforce it, right? But that's kind of interesting, because then I see you submit a budget that proposes a 6-year schedule, 2016, of funding commuter railroads to implement PTC. So is it going to take another 6 years? Now, last I checked, there are not a lot of passengers on freight trains. Isn't that right? I mean, most of them I know, they're carrying freight, not people. But I would think people would be pretty important. Most of those people that were killed out there in that incident were people. It might have disrupted some freight traffic, but it was people. So is this a new policy on people and commuters? We're going to take 6 years, but we are going to hammer those freight people, aren't we?
Well, no. So first of all, we will enforce the deadline against all the railroads, not just the freights.
Okay. But then we have a plan to go forward with.
If they can implement it sooner, that would be great. Happy to use those resources for other items.
Cameras. Metrolink, you got them? Are there cameras in the cabs?
Yes, we have inward-facing cameras in all of our cabs.
Okay, because that's been a recommendation of NTSB for some time since that accident, and I cited all the other times back to '73, and they weren't implemented in most instances.
Ours have been implemented since 2009.
Okay. Last thing. Is TIFIA eligible for use of installation of positive train control? Does anybody know?
TIFIA, not RIF?
Yes. Do we know? Does anybody know? Staff know or anybody? Come on, some of you guys are brilliant on the other side. You don't know? It is? Okay, they think it is. So that's a mechanism for funding. But let me tell you the last thing before I conclude. I have 7 seconds. I was flying up here, and I met a guy in a plane. I didn't know him from Adam's house cat. What are you doing on the plane, Mr. Micah? Well, I'm coming back to D.C. I said, why are you coming back to D.C.? He says, well, I'm with some kind of a project, and we finance projects. And he says it took us between 60 and 90 days to get approval for financing under TIFIA, the private sector. I says, well, what are you doing here? He says, it's taken us a year. He says, these guys are screwing around with the paperwork for a year. So you can go out and get private sector financing while they screw around in DOT. And here's a mechanism that may be available and is available. And you have huge capacity in RIF, and both of them don't work. Did you want to respond on your own time? Because I'm over.
Sure. I believe that under Secretary Fox, both of those programs have moved along much faster than they have previously, and there's always room for improvement.
I've got to go to the medical center.
Thank you, Mr. Micah. And the previous chairman did say that the witness's time was also the member's time, just as a... Ms. Hahn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you, to my colleague, Mr. Capuano, for yielding to the rest of the committee. First of all, I want to commend Metrolink, the second largest rail system by size in the country, for the outstanding work that they have done in meeting our PTC deadline. I like it that you worked closely with your railroad partners, BNSF, Union Pacific, Amtrak, to make sure that their technologies were interoperable, and worked hard to acquire the funds needed to fund the implementation of your system. I want to point out that 85% of the funds that Metrolink used to fund the rollout were from the state of California, and local sources, only 15% were federal. PTC is clearly a top priority for me, and it really is for the American people. I think when the American people hear that we can prevent train accidents and deaths of people by the implementation of PTC, they are also very frustrated that many railroads are not going to be meeting our deadline. But I will say I'd like to go on record and agree to disagree with Chairman Denham that I don't think we should take money from the California High-Speed Rail to pay for PTC. The California High-Speed Rail has it within their budget to make sure that there is PTC on the California High-Speed Rail project. We need to find money for both. I'm going to ask Mr. Mathias my first question. And we've heard from testimony, a major part of the process to implement PTC is acquiring the spectrum. According to Metrolink, the process of acquiring spectrum has been trying and prolonged. It purchased a license for spectrum 5 years ago, and before they can use it, they need FCC's approval. In order to meet the deadline, Metrolink is currently leasing spectrum at the rate of $50,000 per year from freight railroads while awaiting the approval. I think everyone's going to want to know, why has it taken 5 years to approve the use of spectrum? Is this normal? And shouldn't we have, in light of the recent accidents and in light of this urgency to prevent future accidents, shouldn't there be an expedited process for approval for projects that deal with our public safety?
Thank you for that good question, and I can appreciate your concern. We're very glad that Metrolink actually has been able to negotiate a lease and that they will be able to have spectrum necessary to provide the PTC service. We understand their concern and frustration that the spectrum that they had intended to purchase has taken so long to acquire. Unfortunately, it has been mired in federal litigation as well as in a closed proceeding at the Federal Communications Commission. So unfortunately, I can't just provide details. But what we're trying to do is, as much as we can, to get that process, keep that process moving. We've taken the extraordinary step of taking the spectrum that they wish to acquire out of our closed proceeding so that we can move forward. They have several waiver requests that they need that would facilitate their use of the spectrum that are pending before us. We understand they need to update those. We look forward to receiving that information.
Thank you. But again, I think the American people are not going to be very sympathetic with excuses for the FCC not approving the spectrum applications as quickly as possible. And I sort of agree with my colleague, Ms. Brown, on it's sort of difficult to be finding and enforcing the deadline when some of our own agencies are not moving as quickly as most of us would like. So I'm just going to say that. Okay, Mr. Curran, you're a model, as I said. I'm very proud of Metrolink in California. Maybe since you've been able to meet the deadline and you've been able to, jump over the obstacles and through the hoops to actually make this happen, what advice would you give other commuter rail lines in this country who are trying to meet the deadline by the end of the year?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I would like to actually thank Mr. Lenegro for his shout out to our project director, Daryl Maxey, who has been just diligent in pushing this project forward. That sentiment has come all the way from the top ranks of Metrolink, the board, our grantors have made a very, very strong commitment to this project. So the funding that they provided has been really the crucial element in getting this project going, along with that adamant support from our board to really get this project started. So we started early and made a very concerted effort around the clock. Been working very hard at it for many years. So it's hard to give there. I wouldn't say there's a silver bullet for other commuter railroads to accomplish it. It's been a very challenging process. So we do sympathize with the many challenges which we have also encountered. So I would say that the funding is a key element, and having a close working relationship with your freight partners that you operate with, because really that was the other key element for us, was the strong support that we had from our freight partners.
Thank you. And again, you've been a model for the country.
Thank you.
We applaud you.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I had to be at another hearing until just a few minutes ago, but Ms. Feinberg, maybe you've covered this, but let me ask you this. You know, it's taken these railroads several years to get to the point where they are now, and apparently there's still a pretty good ways to go. And I'm wondering, do you have any estimate of how long it's going to take your agency to certify a railroad after this process?
So the step is first a safety plan is submitted to us. So it's basically the railroad's plan for how they will implement PTC and how they will ensure that the system is working. We have received one of those and have turned it back around to the railroad. They take a while to go through because you're not only reading the plan, but you are in close consultation with the railroad, talking through it, offering edits and changes to make sure that the system is going to work. So it takes a while, but we feel pretty confident that as they roll in, we will be able to turn them around, staff up and turn them around in the kinds of time periods that we've laid out for the railroads. But as of now, we've just received one.
Are you satisfied with the progress that the railroads have made thus far?
I'm not satisfied. I would not be satisfied unless the deadline were going to be met.
Well, you know, my dad told me years ago, and I don't remember what he was talking about at the time, but he said everything looks easy from a distance. And I was reading over Mr. Lenegro's testimony just for CSX. It says the tasks are still monumental. And it said CSX has to do a complete airborne laser imaging survey of our entire 21,000-mile network, to make all assets, have all assets mapped to within 7 feet of their precise location, installation of 5,202 wayside units, replacing signals along 7,500 miles of track, installing 1,285 base stations, equipping 3,900 locomotives, training 16,000 employees. I mean, these tasks, monumental is being conservative when you say that. And Mr. Lenegro, tell me about the safety record of CSX so far.
We've been an industry leader for the last 2 or 3 years in safety, sir, and the whole industry, if you go back and look at especially the train accident statistics, has seen significant 40 to 50% reductions in train accidents since the 2000 time period. So, you know, we take safety. Safety is a core value of CSX. Safety is a way of life. It's the first core value that we have, and it's very similar at every other railroad. So, I mean, every day we live and breathe safety, whether it's to improve conditions along the railroad, the track infrastructure, the signaling infrastructure, the equipment side of the house, cars, locomotives, and the human factor side of the house, the training efforts that we do. We have a technology called ERAD, which is a virtual road foreman that looks exactly at how that train was handled to figure out whether there are any anomalies in that train handling, and then have a coaching session with that employee. If they were over speed, all right, we have a conversation with them. If they happen to breach a red signal, they're taken out of service and decertified. I mean, we have lots of things that we're doing. We're starting down the inward-facing camera path, a la Metrolink, to understand the exact behaviors in the cab that contribute to accidents. So I'd say we're doing an awful lot on safety, sir.
Well, the committee staff gave me a statistic a few minutes ago. They said that the freight rail system is 99.995% safe based on the number of trips that are taken. I don't know. That seems to me to be a phenomenal safety record. My staffer, Don Walker, had told me a short time ago that the Wall Street Journal said that 2014 was the safest year ever for the rail industry. Now, I mean, everybody has tremendous sympathy for these families that lost loved ones in the Amtrak accident, but my goodness, and now we're going to be spending billions, already have spent billions and going to be spending billions more to try to make something that's already one of the safest things in the entire world. And I'm thinking that we would be far better off to spend those billions in many, many other ways, cancer research and everything else. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr.
for
Chairman.
being so gracious with your time.
Gracious. Get that, Pete? Gracious.
Yeah, twice.
I want to thank the panel, too. Ms. Feinberg, we're all here today because we think PTC can save lives. I think everybody agrees with that. If you're a week or two or a month late with a report, does anybody die?
No, sir.
Are there any major property losses?
No, sir.
Okay. If one of the major railroads came to you and said, we're not going to make December 31st, but we're going to make January 15th, we're going to make February 1st, are you likely to be imposing big fines on somebody who's going to be a few weeks or a month late?
Highly unlikely.
I didn't think so. Mr. Kerwin, you cost roughly a little over $200 million to institute the PTC in your system. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
How much did the Chatsworth accident cost?
In excess of that amount, I would say.
So, in hindsight, knowing what that accident cost versus what the system cost, the system has already paid for itself.
Yes, sir.
If it's paid for itself on your line, do you think it's a reasonable thing to say that it would pay for itself on any other line in avoided accidents?
Yes, I would agree with that.
I think so, too. I guess nobody here believes, nobody wants any fines. There's no reason to have fines. We all understand that, Mr. Rossino. You know, we have a commuter rail system, too. We get that. But at the same time, we're sitting here 7 years later with some of the major railroads having done virtually nothing. How would you suggest, if we were, let's assume that we could come together as a Congress. By the way, Ms. Feinberg, who set this December 31st deadline?
The Congress.
And are you empowered to ignore that?
No.
Who are you empowered to change that deadline?
No.
So it's only us.
Correct.
Okay. I think that any reasonable person here understands the deadline is not going to be met. Any reasonable person understands the deadline has to be extended. We're not looking to do fines. Now, if we don't, I would not ask Ms. Feinberg or anyone else to ignore the law. I would hope that Congress can come together and do this. At the same time, once we do it, how do we avoid a bad actor from simply ignoring it again for any reasonable period of time, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, without a stick? Mr. Rossino, I mean, and I know I don't want the fines, but how do I do it any other way?
Well, I think as it was brought up here today on many occasions, I believe that at the onset from the 2008 Rail Safety Act, that was a date that was agreed upon. I think once we got into the significant challenges that it...
I understand how we are today. Let's assume today, right now, if I said to you, write a law that says in some period of time, some reasonable period of time, 2, 3, 5 years, pick a time frame, we're going to have this done. How do I then enforce it if I don't have fines?
Well, I think we'd need to look at it at that time, but I think the key issue is right now we aren't going to meet the deadline. We need to, and it's not from lack of effort. If it was from lack of effort, we would
I
have...
respect that, but the bottom line is I don't know any other way to enforce it amongst bad actors. Good actors don't need an enforcement, bad actors do, which is why fines are in place. My presumption is you have contracts with suppliers that give them fines if they don't meet their requirements. we have to have the same thing if we really think the PCC is important. By the way, I also fully agree that the federal government should be participating in paying for this, but we're having that argument. You know the arguments we're having here. I'm with you, but I need 217 other members to agree with that. In the meantime, we can't do anything. So I think that it's pretty clear to me that we have to do something, but to pretend that we do nothing or to pretend that somehow goodness will simply overcome the lack of goodness is ridiculous and unenforceable. We need to come up with a reasonable time frame. We need to allow Ms. Feinberg to enforce the law, whatever it might be. I don't expect you to break the law. I also don't want to fine anybody. So we have to act. And we can do it all day long. We can play games. We can dance around. We can point fingers. We can show what happened 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago. But since 1969, according to the NTSB, according to their own figures, preventable accidents have killed 246 people and have injured 4,263. And I don't know how much money has been lost because no one's put that number together. If it's the cap, the $200 million cap, which, by the way, would have cost Metrolink more if it wasn't for the cap, it's hard to tell, but it seems to me, just rough numbers, it looks like the cap probably would have cost, even with the cap, it would have been about $20 billion that these accidents would have cost. This is a doable action, and it is an action that pays for itself as proof positive by Metrolink. Help us work with you to get it done. And by the way, Ms. Kerwin, Mr. Mathias, earlier you said you had 8,500 polls agreed to, but that doesn't count the 11,000 that you did previously. It's my understanding you're closer to 20,000 polls across the country that have been approved. And that 20,000 is about out of 35,000 that they will need. So we've already got 2/3 of the locations approved and ready to go. Is that right?
Correct.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Kapp. Mr. Barletta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Safety is my first priority. There's no question. And positive train control is a necessary tool to improve safety. But the fact of the matter is that most railroads will not have the technology installed by December 31st, 2015 deadline. Today, I'm wondering what happens on January 1st, 2016, if the deadline remains. Mr. Lonegro, today, Ms. Feinberg again committed to hold the railroads accountable for not meeting the PTC deadline, including potential fines and restrictions of service. If the deadline is not extended, what actions will the railroads likely take? I want to know what's going to happen on January 1st.
Well, sir, there's one way to be compliant with the deadline, and that's not to move TIH, PIH commodities or passengers, which is an untenable situation if you're a passenger agency or a TIH, PIH shipper. So the railroads right now are in a very difficult place with a deadline that can only be congressionally moved. So we, again, have a lot of folks that are evaluating how we look at the common carrier obligation and how we look at the PTC mandate to, in essence, figure out is there a way to navigate through, breaking the law on one hand or breaking the law on the other hand. And we have a very similar situation with Amtrak and the commuter agencies where we're required to move the passengers or allow them to move their passengers over our lines. And again, we have a PTC mandate and we have a passenger requirement, and I hate to say we're being backed into a corner in terms of which law should we violate, and it may be that the path forward, it really does involve cessation of service, but we're all looking at that, we're all evaluating. You heard a member earlier talk about increased tort liability. We certainly worry about that as well. So it's an untenable situation, as I mentioned in my opening statement.
Mr. Orsino, in your testimony you mentioned concerns within the APTA rail conference about the ability of commuter rail to operate past the PTC deadline as it relates to liability and coverage. Can you further describe what liability and coverage issues would prevent commuter rail that doesn't meet the PTC deadline from operating?
Well, when we were at the conference, a question was raised on whether we can operate or individual agencies can operate past the deadline because you would be operating outside the confines of the law, and there may be restrictions in some of the liability coverages. And all the commuter railroads are now going back with their risk and legal teams to take a look and see if that's the case.
You've already said that Metro won't make the December 31st, 2015 deadline, and in Pennsylvania, SEPTA will not make the deadline either. If the worst-case scenario occurs and commuter rail does not receive any flexibility on the PTC deadline, how would commuters who rely on Metra or other commuter rail like SEPTA be impacted by operation changes?
That would depend on to the degree of what actually happens. If railroads were forced to close down because of liability reasons and insurance reasons, for us alone, that would put 300,000 passengers on the roads already that are congested, and that wouldn't be a good solution.
In Pennsylvania, SEPTA is furthest behind in the onboard vehicle locomotive system installations. You also cited in your testimony that one of the biggest PTC challenges is onboard software, and that final production release date is not yet known. Can you tell us why this has been such a challenge?
I don't have that technical knowledge, but I believe Listener Lenegro does.
PTC in the very beginning was somewhat theoretical in the way that the regulation was published in terms of what it had to accomplish and how it had to accomplish that. And so we took a system that was much smaller, much less complicated, and much less mature, and are through the period of the last 7 years really working to the point where it can comply with all of the regulations and the functionality that has been required. I would tell you that from a software perspective, we are getting closer, meaning, you know, arguably the end of the year, we could have a piece of software that is very, very close. At the same time, we have committed to not implement software that has any critical defects or severe defects, but yet we are willing to deploy software with medium or minor defects, right? So we're not really trying to get to perfect necessarily, but we are making sure that it can provide all the functionality and doesn't create a situation where there, you know, a safety problem is introduced. Just in the last month or so, we have found a safety critical defect in the onboard software, which has to be corrected, has to be retested, has to be taken back to the field, and the same holds true for the back office software. So, you know, these are people in the supplier community. This is their business, right? This is what they do for a living. And if they're unable, you know, to tackle the technical challenge that has been put in front of all of us, you know, that gives you some understanding of the complexity of the challenge that we have, because that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I'd like to recognize Ms. Brown. If you'll indulge me just for a second, though, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Rokita. But I did want to enter one piece of information for the record without objection. This is from California High-Speed Rail. This is their June 2009 request for funding. On their request, they request $230 million from the ARA investment strategy, from those funds that have been allocated to California, $230 million. Here's a map here where it shows exactly where those improvements would be. Can you zoom that in? Clearly, move it up. This corridor here, positive train control, $230 million. California High-Speed Rail thinks that they can do it. They've requested it. This is in California. We want to have the safety improvements there. Here's a good funding source to do that.
Mr. Chairman, understood. My staff passed me a note during the hearing that states that high-speed rail, our high-speed rail funding has been at $328 million. So we will follow up with you and look at those two numbers together and respond.
Thank you, and I'll have a staff member bring that down just for your record as we continue this ongoing exchange. And with that, I'd like to recognize Ms. Brown for our second round of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but would you indulge me for a minute? Because when I was out the room, Mr. Macker said that Amtrak had not implemented positive train control from New Haven to Boston. Not only did they implement it, it was the first in the country, and I want to submit that for the record. Thank you. Now, Metrolink, who I visited with several times in California, and I just want to mention that you had the support of the state, the local recovery money, and funding is the issue for all of the commuter lines. And let's don't sit here and act like it is not, and a lot of the local resources are not available for the other lines. With that, I want to go on to Frank, because you know, I want to say all those great things about CSX, but you are the one that's here representing the Class 1 railroads, and they said that there are some positive players and there's some that's not. Would you give us an up-to-date? Because we need an extension, the idea that we're going to start finding people, and then where's that money going? A deficit reduction? I want the money to go into the system. So would you tell us who are these negative players that they're talking about?
Thank you, Member Brown. There are no bad actors here. This technology is very difficult to implement. The scale proposition that we each have is very challenging, as one of the members mentioned earlier, in terms of the scale of the CSX deployment. For at least the major U.S. Class 1s, the scale is about the same, right? We all have that major, challenge. The Canadian railroads have a slightly smaller footprint because they don't run as much in the United States, and there is no PTC mandate in Canada, so their footprint is slightly smaller. So, at least in the Class 1 world, there are no bad actors. We are all going about this with
That's
all
not what I've heard, though. And are you all working with the commuter lines also?
We are. Each of us has a different set of commuters that we work with. So on the CSX footprint, we have commuters in and around D.C. We certainly have commuters in Chicago. And then we have a full spectrum of commuters and Amtrak that run, in essence, from Baltimore up to Boston. So we're in active discussions with them literally all of the time. We hosted a summit in Chicago at Mr. Orsino's facility where we brought in the Class 1s and the committee that I chair at the industry level. We brought in all the commuters and all the short lines and did our best to try to help educate folks on the state of the technology, some of the challenges that we face, so they wouldn't have to face the same challenges as they deployed on their railroads. We had, I think, a good dialogue, and Mr. Orsino can certainly chime in. I think we had a good dialogue. We've kept that dialogue up. We have another meeting planned for later in this year where we can re-engage and reassess where we are, both individually and collectively.
What is the drop-dead amount of time that you need, Frank?
Yeah, as an industry, one of the things that we've come forward with is the ability to be hardware complete by 2018 and completely rolled out by 2020. And again, I want to make sure that everybody understands, by the end of 2018, okay, we will have as an industry 87% of the PTC footprint installed and implemented, meaning we are operational with PTC, and that's based on current plans that were in place certainly before the Amtrak tragedy, and then the remaining 13% is really what comes in those last 2 years. So literally we are starting to deploy PTC in operational mode right now, right? And then it ramps up from here fairly linearly, but ramps up from here through the end of 2020.
Mrs. Feinberg, how long will it take you all to inspect? If they complete it in 2018, you have some work to do. How long will it take you to verify the system?
Well, they would submit to us a plan, which we would then turn around to them. Then they would complete implementation, and I think things would move quite quickly. The issue there would be, that you would be 3 years past the deadline at that point.
Yeah, we understand. Everybody understand that. And we understand that the deadline is not realistic and nobody's going to meet it, and we have some concerns about the fines. Mr. Mathis, I have a real concern about the spectrum, and we've talked a lot about it. Even when it's implemented, what about the local respondents? We need to be able to talk to each other. 9/11, we discovered that we couldn't talk to each other. And then Katrina, we're still not talking to each other. And even though they're implementing something and Amtrak is implementing something, and then you have those local responders, how come we don't have a dedicated for emergency for this country?
Thank you for that question. I think that Congress has worked very hard and diligently to create an infrastructure for a national interoperable public safety communication system, and I think that's being addressed in that way, and it's in a separate spectrum band and being handled in a separate process, but that's on the way.
Mr. Mathis, failure is not an option. We really need to get it done. Thank you.
I think the gentlelady's time's expired. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Appreciate everyone's testimony. Mr. LaNegro, I had a couple questions for you about the 2 people in a cab situation. In our last hearing, NTSB Chairman Hart testified that having 2-person cabs didn't necessarily improve safety, and he was on a panel with several union members and others. I wonder what your thoughts are on that kind of statement.
Well, we have 2 people in the cab of our locomotives on our mainline trains. We certainly over, I'd say, the period of years, if not decades in the future, we'll look for the opportunity to reduce the crew size from 2 to 1 if the technology supports that and we're able to negotiate an appropriate agreement with our labor unions. I mean, there is a path forward for that. Again, when the technology gets to the point where having 2 people in the cab really is no longer necessary.
Roger. Last hearing, Ms. Feinberg stated that the FRA is looking at having a 2-person crew situation as an interim solution, along with probably some additional backstops as well, until PTC is implemented, before deadline, after deadline, whatever that is. Would you be supportive of that?
Well, on the freight side, I think it's not necessary. We already have it. I think maybe she was referring to the commuter side of the house, which and the Amtrak side of the house, which generally operates with 1 person in the cab, although they certainly have crew members in the train itself. But we already have 2, and again, already.
Same question. This last question to you, Mr. Orsino.
We operate our trains with 1 person in the cab and 2 people in the body of the train that are both rules qualified. 2 members up in the cab doesn't necessarily mean it's a safer situation. There's been many instances where there's been accidents where 2 people have been up in the cab. So we believe we don't support that initiative.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kerwin, same question to you.
Yeah, we have also evaluated this in the past, and we will continue to monitor the recommendations from the FRA and NTSB on this issue.
Okay, thank you. And back to you, Mr. Logrino. Can you tell us, you said you currently have 2 people in a cab on all routes that will require PTC by 2016, or?
Correct. All mainline routes, yes, sir.
Okay. So CSX having 2-person crew as an interim solution until PTC is fully implemented on PTC required routes is logistically doable.
It's already being done.
It's already, yeah, okay. So then would industry be supportive of having 2-person crews as an interim solution until PTC is fully implemented? Thus, theoretically, you would be complying with the requirements of PTC if you had 2 people in a cab.
Well, there is no requirement for 2 people in the cab today in the way.
But as an interim solution.
Well, we already have it, and anytime we would want to go from 2 to 1, we would certainly have to work with FRA to get approval to do that. So it's just not necessary, at least with respect to the freight railroads, given where we are and the steps that we would have to go through to remove 1 member of the crew.
Okay, thank you. And the only other thing I'd add for the record is that in addition to any of the other things Ms. Feinberg may or may not have been blamed for today, she now has apparently sent Mr. Micah to the hospital, which obligates me to have to go visit him. So I add that to your stack. And with that, my questions are done, and I don't see any more questions from members. So on behalf of Chairman Denham, let me thank you each for coming again today. We thank the members of the audience for their attention today. We move forward. With that, hearing no other business before the committee, this hearing is adjourned.